All right, let's continue on this. And as we mark International Anti-Corruption Day, we are now joined via Zoom by senior researcher at Corruption Watch, Melusi Ncala, to weigh in on this day where the world is putting a spotlight on corruption and finding ways to deal with it. A very good afternoon to you, Melusi. Always a pleasure to have you on the show, sir.
Thank you, Flo, and good afternoon to the viewers out there.
I must say, seeing that, South Africa is joining the rest of the world in commemorating International Anti-Corruption Day, seeing that made me think, well, that's kind of ironic given the fact that South Africa is probably one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Maybe you can paint a picture for us as a researcher in terms of where exactly we are when we're talking about corruption of the countries in the world. You know, we always look at South Africa and Nigeria, but obviously corruption, there are pockets of corruption everywhere. But where exactly does South Africa stand?
Yeah, no, South Africa's story is not a glamorous one, Flo. And it's mainly because of how we manage our affairs, how funds are often looted, and how there's a blatant disregard for laws and processes, and also a lack of accountability. Now, how we often measure how a country stands in terms of corruption or its anti-corruption efforts. There are several studies for this. There's the Corruption Perception Index, from which this year's edition already places South Africa quite low on its ranking. South Africa scores 44 often and has been for the past few years, round about in that margin. And that where this is on a scale where, you know, when you're at 0, you're perceived to be highly corrupt, and 100 quite clean.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you know, there are other studies where pertaining to organized crime, from which we are part of the top 20 most violent, or at least organized crime countries in the world.
Yeah. I mean, at this point, you know, when you hear leadership talking about corruption, it seems a lot like lip service or, you know, rhetoric. Is this something that we can tackle in this country? It seems so endemic.
It does seem endemic. I mean, you know, some people are quite pleased to see that there's some stability in law enforcement institutions, such as your NPAs, the SAPS, and of course the anti-corruption fora that have been established, like your National Advisory Council Against Corruption, for instance, as well as other significant multi-stakeholder forums that are partnerships between government, private sector, and civil society. So in that respect, you know, South Africa is showing good intent to say that, you know, we acknowledge that this is a big problem. Where we often fall short is in securing, making sure that our whistleblowers are safe, often, and also holding people accountable, especially powerful individuals.
Yeah. Melusi, you talk about the fact that it seems South Africa has the good intent, has the intention, and indeed acknowledges the problem of corruption in the country. I think that, you know, South Africans generally, we understand and we acknowledge that there is corruption in this country, but what we want to see is, you know, implementation of strategies in terms of combating issues that pertain to corruption. And what should we be looking at when it comes to the implementation part, which I think is where a lot of us would like to see action?
If we accept that corruption is systemic, then we need to look at our architecture in terms of what's happening on that framework. Do we have a whistleblower agency, for example, that will see to it that people are protected? It cannot be, for example, that 24 Abahlali activists have been murdered in the last few years, for example. So we need to look at that. We need to look at our laws. Do they actually compel people to be accountable? We need to look at institutions such as Parliament to ask the question, do they actually play their oversight role?
Yeah.
You know, point in case would be this Phala matter, to ask the question, well, will Parliament hold the president accountable next week, for example?
Yeah. You know, I was listening to some of the conversations being had and some of the speeches this afternoon at that anti-corruption summit, and you know, the issue of the definition of corruption was really sort of ironed out. But I thought some of the examples were quite fickle. Maybe that's a good point to start, and maybe this is where I should have started our conversation. You know, what exactly corruption is, and especially pertaining to our country.
You know, the kind of globally accepted definition of corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for personal or private gain. But, you know, it depends on which perspective you use to actually apply it in your understanding of corruption. You know, there are legal definitions of corruption, and these are provided for by PRECA, for example. The United Nations has its own definition. So, but all of these speak to one fundamental aspect, that often you have people in powerful position who will abuse their power in a way so as to make sure that they gain personally, but it's also at a disadvantage to a greater community, that there are always people losing, and it's often the ordinary people that are losing, and it ultimately affects what happens in terms of attaining human rights, basic services, etc., etc.
All right, Melusi, always a pleasure. Thank you very much, sir, for giving us your time here on SABC News. Melusi Ncala is a senior researcher at Corruption Watch. Many thanks to you there.